Good afternoon. On behalf of Drew Gilpin-Faust and the Office of the President, and Professor Homi K. Bhabha, Director of the Mahindra Humanities Center here at Harvard University, allow me to extend a warm welcome to this, the Tanner Seminar, which is the culmination of the Tanner Lectures at Harvard University 2014. My name is Professor Jonathan L. Walton. I'm the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and Professor of Religion and Society at Harvard Divinity School. I would like to say just a few words about the Tanner Lectures prior to introducing this year's special guest. Tanner Lectures are presented annually at each one of the 9 universities, including Cambridge, Harvard, Michigan, Oxford, Princeton, Stanford, Utah, Yale, and the University of California, Berkeley. The Tanner Lectures were established by the American scholar and industrialist Obert Clark Tanner. And in creating the lectureships, Professor Tanner said, "I hope these lectures will contribute to the intellectual and moral life of mankind," spelling incorrect. "I see them simply as a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values. This understanding may be pursued for its own intrinsic worth, but it may also eventually have practical consequences for the quality of personal and social life," end quote. The lectures are given once a year here at Harvard, and they are to promote the moral and political life, and therefore we bring to campus philosophers, lawyers, law professors, political figures, authors, and anyone who has something to contribute to the interesting pursuit of human values. Past lecturers have included Esther Duflo, Richard Dawkins, Onara O'Neill, and Jürgen Habermas. And therefore, we are pleased to have with us this year, as the lecturer and as the centerpiece of today's Tanner Seminar, Dr. Rowan Williams, who will add luster to this distinguished list. Dr. Williams is the past Archbishop of Canterbury and current master of Magdalen College in Cambridge. Just to say a few things about Rowan Williams. Rowan Douglas Williams, born in Swansea, south of Wales, studied theology at Christ College, Cambridge, earning doctorate at Oxford. 1986, returned to Oxford after 2 years as a lecturer at the College of Resurrection as the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity and to serve a canon of Christ Church. In 1991, Professor Williams accepted election and consecration as Bishop of Monmouth. In 1999, elected Archbishop of Wales, and in 2002, Archbishop Williams was confirmed Archbishop of Canterbury, the symbolic head of the worldwide Anglican Communion. He would go on to serve for the next decade. He is acknowledged internationally as an outstanding scholar, teacher, author. He is the author of more than 30 books across a very wide range of related fields. And he has also written throughout his career on moral, ethical, and social topics, increasingly turning his attention to contemporary cultural and interfaith issues. As the New Yorker magazine described him upon stepping down as Archbishop, he is a thinker in a world of increasingly harsh theologies. Yet, as evidenced in his commitment to keep the Anglican Communion whole during his tenure, he is also a loving pastoral presence in a world increasingly defined by fear and hatred. And it is at this intersection, a thinker who reasons with his heart and loves with his mind, that we welcome to this Tanner Seminar today, Dr. Rowan Douglas Williams. Professor Bhabha has assembled a distinguished panel of scholars to join Professor Williams this afternoon, and therefore, we turn it over to him at this time.
Thank you, Professor Walton, for those wonderful, warming, and welcoming words. Thank you for settling us into the right frame of mind for this afternoon's discussion. Just one quick, somewhat forward-looking agenda item for all those gathered here. Next Tanner lecturer in next April will be Carlo Ginzburg, the historian. We'll be giving, so I thought this might be something of interest to those of you who are here today. He's just accepted, and we're delighted to have him next year. This year, I can honestly say, has been a remarkable celebration of the intellectual and the moral life in the company of Rowan Williams and our splendid discussants, some of whom have done great service and are no longer here, but we have with us today a quite remarkable group of respondents. Amy Hollywood, Richard Kearney, Emma Rothschild, and Nicholas Watson. In the pamphlet you have, they are fully and fairly described. So I will add nothing to that. But let's get straight into the discussion of really a very challenging set of issues. There are a number of questions that have emerged over the last couple of days, and those are some of them we will bring back, but for the moment, let's start with a fresh page, and let me ask Nicholas to kick off. Thank you very much, Nicholas, for agreeing to do this.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Rowan Williams for a typically lucid and thought-provoking set of reflections, and Homi Bhabha for inviting me to be a member of this panel. My own reflections begin where Dr. Williams began with Simon Baron-Cohen's 0 degrees of empathy, but develop in their own directions while alluding to a number of other moments in his 2 lectures, as well as to the responses and discussions that followed. Although Baron-Cohen has come under fire over the last 2 days, as conversations have tended to fall into the defensive pose ubiquitous to humanist rhetoric at the present moment, Dr. Williams showed that 0 degrees of empathy does humanists an inadvertent service by invoking the very ethical terminology it claims to supersede. I followed with admiration Dr. Williams's careful proof, not only that empathy does not equal virtue, let alone justice, but also that our continuing need of the language of virtue, justice, goodness, and even evil follows from the fact of human participation in culture. Despite the crucial role empathy turned out to play in the lectures and the social formation of human personhood, I also thought I detected a reluctance to allow it too much sway in our consideration of justice in particular. By the time we reached Gillian Rose, it began to feel as though empathy might be reaching its limits as a useful starting point for responding to the vast inequities that call out for our attention. Despite the invocations of culture, a term that necessarily in turn evokes its companion, history, most of the discussion over the past 2 days has kept within the rather narrow chronological bounds dictated by the use of the term empathy in the work of phenomenologists in the Husserlian tradition. Although Dr. Williams accepted as a friendly amendment the suggestion that empathy's history might begin in the Enlightenment with Johann Gottfried Herder, it has been left to Regina Schwartz to look back further in considering the tough-minded connections that the Judeo-Christian tradition has made between social justice and not empathy, but love, from Leviticus to Lear. Yet history should, of course, be part of the discussion, and not only for the obvious reason that the thought formations of the past may have resources for our own thinking. I was startled by David Tracy's assertion that critical theory necessarily allows us to understand empathy better than our predecessors, as though ethical inquiry aspires to follow the progressivist paradigm in place in the sciences. History should also be part of the discussion because the past, as much as the neighbor or the stranger, summons us to empathic connection and its paradoxes. As historical beings, we all maintain relationships with earlier versions of ourselves, with parents, mentors, ideas left behind, lives begun elsewhere. Our sense of ourselves as both continuous with and alien to our rapidly diversifying pasts is constitutive of our identities as individuated persons. In a wider sense, history plays a similar role in constituting cultural identities. Even Western modernity, with its notoriously close historical threshold and energetic investment in the near future, renders itself incoherent to itself to the extent that it ceases to situate itself historically in time, as well as contextually in space. An important feature of Dr. Williams's lectures was their insistence that empathy requires the simultaneous recognition of our distance from and our identification with the other. So it is with our relationship to the historical past, which needs to be known as at once intimate and alien, still at work within contemporary culture, but also fundamentally distanced from it. Several of Dr. Williams's books, I think especially here of On Christian Theology, offer rich instructions in the empathic reading of earlier Christian thinkers and thought forms that such an understanding enables. A mode of wrestling with angels indispensable, I think he will agree, to the self-awareness that any religious, intellectual, or cultural tradition needs if it is to continue to flourish. What happens if we follow Regina Schwartz in extending the history of empathy back in time, behind the Enlightenment, where it comes into being, after all, in the context of what Charles Taylor would call a newly buffered understanding of the isolated self, into the pre-modern period in which the Judeo-Christian and indeed Platonic terminology of love held sway? A provocative answer to this admittedly huge question is given by the medieval historian Karl Morrison in a 1988 book entitled I Am You, The Hermeneutics of Empathy in Western Literature, Art, and Theology. For Morrison, the phrase I am you is the signature of a mode of cognition vital to the Western intellectual tradition from the 2nd century to about the 17th. To say I am you is in the first instance to affirm identification. Morrison finds a variety of distinct cultural sites in which the identification of self with other is represented: aesthetic contemplation, pedagogical learning, mystical union, and a number of others, in all of which the end of a given activity is a particular kind of knowing. In the cognitive model named by I am you, to know is to become, to participate in a mingling of self and other that affirms, to invoke Taylor again, that the I is porous, constantly formed and reformed as it loses itself empathically in one or another desired object. But Morrison also implies 3 corollaries. First, in its attempt to enter the being of the other, I am you assumes that empathic knowing normatively involves inequality of power, and unlike discourses of empathy produced by modern democratic cultures, does not understand such inequality as necessarily problematic. If it is all right to apprehend the union of the soul with God as the joining of the almost nothing with the all, it is almost all right to describe, say, sexual joining in the language of dominance and submission. Only the discourse of friendship, Morrison avers, affirms in pre-modern culture the equality of the self with the other as a primary objective. I think this is interesting inasmuch as modern discussions sometimes find the power differentials that exist in empathetic understanding difficult even to acknowledge, let alone to theorize. Second, however, in many versions of the I am you paradigm, knowing is nonetheless relational. This in principle means that the roles of subject and object can be interchangeable. Nominative can become accusative, the first person, the second person, and vice versa. Mystical writing offers a particularly complex set of examples here. Since the I of mystical assent, it's incorrect to call this I an agent, although he initially understands himself in that way, is the subordinate, not the dominant partner. Accounts of mystical union represent the I as precisely objectified, turned into you by the overwhelming experience of the nominative subjecthood of God. Although this experience of total subordination can in turn find expression, at least temporarily, in a pluralization of subjecthood as I am you becomes we are us. In other areas such as demonic possession, such plurality becomes a matter for horror. Third and most important to Dr. Williams's account of the paradoxes of empathy, I am you encodes and thus acknowledges its own impossibility. Coiled within the statement I am you lies the counterstatement I am not you. This is partly because I am you is an oxymoron, partly because if we refuse to understand it as such, it morphs into I am I, denying not only the distance between self and other, but the independent existence of the other altogether, as happens in the modern discourses of colonialism and enslavement, and in the medieval genres that explore the condition of erotic solipsism. In fact, despite its desire to become the other, despite its claim that desire itself is a mode of knowing, empathetic cognition is only constructive or virtuous in this model when the contrary claims of I am you and I am not you are kept in systematic tension. Again, mystical theology offers sophisticated examples, of which the most familiar might be the fierce tension between affirmation and denial in the works of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, of which Charles Stang has written so well. Recent extrapolations from medieval mysticism almost always relax this kind of tension. On one side, studies of the history of spirituality, a term that resonates powerfully outside the academy, treats the medieval discourse of compassion, another important synonym for empathy, I think not mentioned yet, as a matter of affective and bodily identification, an imagined union without difference between self and other, devotee and Christ. On the other side, the intellectual fashion for apophatic theology within the academy, which appears to align so neatly with the hermeneutics of suspicion David Tracy associated with critical theory, forgets that the denial of God's names and the unknowing to which this leads presuppose a countervailing hermeneutics of trust. Both neglect what Morrison suggestively calls the hermeneutic play inherent in this empathetic cognitive system, its ready admission that the conjoined projects of knowing and becoming are always incomplete, give us, like any relationship, dialectic without resolution. In a way, it's odd that Baron Cohen understands his contribution to the study of empathy and the good in such absolute terms, since it would seem one of the promises of cognitive science that it may show us in detail how knowing and becoming are indeed conjoined in the constantly developing human brain. My time is nearly up, but in closing, I'd like to say something brief and extremely presumptuous about one of Dr. Williams's closing remarks on both the last 2 days. This is about how the language of empathy is now used to speak about God. Resisting a modern and, I imagine, partly evangelical understanding of a feeling, even an impassioned God, Dr. Williams affirmed the divine difference, saying movingly that a God who does not feel as we feel, know our pain as we know it, is a God without an agenda. I have no position to take here, but from within my own field of medieval studies, I would draw attention to one conceptual and ethical possibility the notion of an empathic God seems to hold open, that of a particular kind of theology of creation. Some medieval poets and visionaries, and I'm thinking here especially of two 14th century English contemporaries, William Langland and Julian of Norwich, view God's relationship with the creation in precisely empathic terms, not because they deny the divine difference, but because they understand the incarnation as, in effect, a transformative event in the divine economy of being. You're not allowed to say that, I know. Incarnation, and by extension creation, matters to God, says Langland, because it allows God to experience what otherwise he could not. That's the condition of limit, the experience of experience itself, which is one basis of empathy as Dr. Williams described it, the experience, as he said, of not being able to see your own back. God becomes man to see the sorrow of dying, writes Langland, because he needed to know need. For Julian, Adam's fall into sin and Christ's fall into Christ's fall into the flesh are codependent, one the created reflex of the other. One of the sites in which empathy might serve the purposes of justice in our contemporary situation is the environment. That strangely separated name we give to the physical and biological world in which ourselves and cultures have their being in time. I wonder what theologies of creation and a divine interaction in creation might be needed in the decades to come, not least to disturb our sense that empathy and justice are merely about people, that no call to impossible understanding comes to us from our fellow inhabitants of the natural order itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas, for coming in on time.
I didn't know there was a clock.
I'm watching. Emma Rothschild.
Well, Rowan Williams, in the first of these two remarkable lectures, described the new policies or politics of empathy with which he's been concerned as founded on a narrowing down and privatizing of ethical discourse. I want to suggest that the lectures point to a more general critique of the privatization and individualism, including methodological individualism of recent decades. And I want to illustrate this with two comments, one of which is historical, and one has to do more or less with science fiction. Let me first say what a great honor it is to participate in this week's events. We all, I think, view Rowan Williams with Achtung as well as admiration, with a special and awed kind of respect. I actually have the great good fortune to be a fellow of the college, Magdalen College, Cambridge, of which Rowan Williams is the head. So you'll have to forgive me if I occasionally slip into the ordinary domestic locution of Magdalen life and address him as master. As in, please could you pass the salt, master? But not perhaps so suitable for the Mahindra Humanities Centre. Well, the historical illustration I want to talk about is from the late 18th century. I want to return to Adam Smith's moral theory, which was discussed briefly on Tuesday. I do so not so much out of an insistence on the genealogy of ideas of Einfühlung, but because of the relationship between the idealization of empathy and the idealization of the market economy, of which Smith was also such a brilliant theorist. And this seems to me to be central to the more general critique of privatizing and narrowing. Smith's view of moral judgment was strikingly close, I'd like to suggest, to reflexive or recursive empathy in Stein's and Williams's sense. Stein cites Smith, interestingly enough, in relation to the knowledge of the strange or foreign or other I. We can never form a judgment of our own sentiments, Smith wrote, I quote, unless we remove ourselves, as it were, from our own natural station and see them, I quote, as at a certain distance from us. We can do this in no other way than by endeavoring to view them with the eyes of other people, or as other people are likely to view them. If Smith's work is understood not as a study of sympathy, but in the way he himself described it, as an analysis of how people judge the conduct and character, first of other people, their neighbors, and then of themselves, it is concerned with very much the same questions as these lectures. The metaphors of seeing are everywhere in the theory of moral sentiments. Smith uses the words I and I's 56 times. But it is about conversation as well as observation. It is a study, above all, of moral imagination and of the construction of the I in relation to other I's. Smith indeed used the expression other people an astonishing 84 times in the theory. And it was this conversational, essentially social explanation of moral judgment that seemed particularly subversive to Smith's friends in the radically changed environment after his death in 1790. as Dugald Stewart wrote of Smith, still, he insists, that our moral sentiments have always some secret reference either to what are or to what we imagine ought to be the sentiments of others. Still, he contends that the authority of the conscience is derived from the outside world. And the extraordinary narratives that are so characteristic of Smith's moral writings are essential to this view of moral judgment, as in what I've called the Raskolnikov passages about the criminal for whom, quoting Smith, solitude is still more dreadful than society, and who reflects, continuing to quote Smith, with terror and amazement about the manner in which mankind would look upon him and what would be the expression of their countenance and of their eyes. In The Wealth of Nations, too, there is a vivid description of coming to a great city and finding oneself sunk in obscurity and darkness, observed and attended to by nobody. Well, the Smith of these insights does not fit easily into the triumphalism of the individual and the market, although moments in the discussion following the first lecture did give me a sense of how a parody view of Smithian sympathy and a parody view of Smithian markets could fit together into what could be described in an evocative phrase as compassionate conservatism. Efficiency of outcomes and empathy, possibly charity, for the suffering that might ensue. But there is a different consequence of Smith's theory, which I think is related to these lectures. The question about which I very much hope that Rowan Williams will say more in the published version, and I think I'm echoing what David Hempton said yesterday here, has to do with the connection between the ethical exchanges he describes and what he calls strategic or structural questions. This is the question of scale, or of the relationship of the individual with her own connections to another and another and another, to what Williams calls an entire social world of moral possibilities. And this is also the question of what is to be done. Smith's own emphasis, to return to that period, was very much on a domestic conversational morality of connections within families and among friends. His recommendations were largely to do with education, which was one of the matters in The Wealth of Nations, in respect of which he was clearly in favor of what would now be called government intervention. In The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he was mostly concerned with the family and in favor, rather endearingly, of parents showing respect for their children. The Theory of Moral Sentiments inspired some of the idols of the late Enlightenment in France, including in respect of, and this is very evocative of the discussions we've been having, encouraging even very young children to reflect on, quote, short moral stories, to read novels, and to, quoting again, reflect on their sentiments. These were associated, for the philosopher Condorcet, with a commitment to equality within the family and to an interesting presumption that what he called justness of spirit was the most widely distributed of all human characteristics. Now, in the early years of the French Revolution, and very much unlike Smith, Condorcet was in a position to propose an extensive program of universal public instruction along these lines, along the way, defending himself against the accusation that he sought, quote, to attach a philosopher to every cradle. This was a scaling of domestic morality to an entire society. But these schemes were from the outset counterposed to the very different and more impatient project of a revolutionary catechism, in which the principles of virtue were to be imprinted upon the child. In the aftermath of the Revolutionary Terror, the permissive or liberal policies were completely abandoned in favor, eventually, of the restoration of a more traditional catechism in France and a system of national education, in part on the basis of fear, which would stamp, this was the word used, young children with instantaneous and unreflecting virtue. This was an attempt, among other things, to provide some security as a matter of urgency that the terror itself would never again recur. Well, it's this which brings me to science fiction. For it seems to me that the public neuroscience with which Rowan Williams began is the reflection, in part, of a contemporary sense of urgency about security and also of contemporary impatience with long, even lifelong, moral discussions. Just to illustrate, discussions of behavioral economics and neuroscience are concerned with the architecture of choice more than with the negotiations of administration, or, in relation to development, with quasi-medical or perhaps even actual medical interventions in the causal process by which poverty causes stress and stress causes poverty. A politics of empathy, or a politics of mirror neurons of the sort that Rowan Williams rightly finds in Prospect so disturbing, could intervene with, let's say, empathic glasses, such that individuals would be rewarded for wearing devices which enable them to see the emotional conditions of others. Or it could veer, especially in circumstances of urgency and genuine fear, as in the aftermath of the terror, towards innovative ways of ensuring security and preventing cruelty. Those here who follow discussions of the so-called non-lethal uses of chemical and biological weapons will know about interventions which target the aggressiveness of an enemy population, hesitation drugs or cowardice drugs, as it were. But what of empathy interventions? A simple mist or a snack to enhance empathy and inhibit cruelty. In a less hysterical sense, it seems to me that there are aspects of contemporary life which are deeply concerning in respects of the slow and essentially proximity-based processes that Rowan Williams and Adam Smith describe. The most obvious is the expansion in the proportion of our lives, and especially of the lives of people younger than those, on average, than those here this afternoon, which is spent in virtual exchanges. There was a wonderful moment on Tuesday when I thought that Rowan Williams and David Tracy on the stage were going to break into a dance routine about irony and empathy. But irony is notoriously elusive in the online world. And ironic empathy, or empathy that turns out to be ironic, is frighteningly cruel. Think of the 39 steps. In a local sense, I believe that the relationship of humanities and science instruction as an extended involvement with, again, another and another and another, to instruction which is both very large scale and very rapid, almost instantaneous, is the greatest challenge now for this university as it is for others. I said at the outset that the privatizing of ethical discourse seems to me to have something to do with a now well-established methodological individualism, and particularly with the difficulties now of the theory or even the imagination of things like long and boring political discussions or discussions of economic regulation or penal institutions, which are intermediate to the individual and the market. So I do very much hope that Rowan Williams will say more in the future about the connections between moral judgments which are within the little capacities of individual lives and the entire social world of possibilities. including about the historical question of the future of instruction, which is another long and boring subject, but which is close to our own responsibilities. Thank you, Rowan. Thank you, Master.
Thank you, Emma. Richard Kearney.
Well, it's a great honor to be here, to be able to respond and make some comments on Rowan Williams's lectures, on the other as myself and myself as stranger. And I want to pick up on his point about the danger in an overemphasis on a certain kind of empathy that can lead to a merging of identities and a dissolution of boundaries. So we collapse into sameness. And his call for a certain distance and difference to be maintained always in the relationship with the other. I want to link that with a remark he made that Emma's also just cited at the end of yesterday's lecture about stories and the importance of stories. And I'd like to begin with a story and then move on to make two basic points, one about the phenomenology of empathy, on foot of his remarks about Edith Stein, and then something about the theology of empathy as it relates to the empathic God. The story goes as follows. In 1992, I was moderating a workshop with ex-paramilitary prisoners in Northern Ireland in the city of Derry, London Derry. And one of the prisoners from the Long Kesh, an IRA terrorist convicted, Republican, stood up and told of how he had been taken one day from his bed in the Bogside and bound and gagged and blindfolded by gloved and balaclavaed loyalist gang, taken to a barn, tied to a chair, and a gun was put to his head. And just before he was about to be shot, he asked could he smoke a cigarette. So his assassin took off the glove and lit a cigarette and unbound one hand and let him smoke the cigarette. And during the course of smoking that cigarette, he told a story. He told of how and why he had joined the IRA and had come to kill people and plant bombs in a pub. And he said, my grandfather was taken out by the RIC and was beaten to a pulp and was paraplegic for the rest of his life. My father was in the wrong place at the wrong time, taken and tortured by the B Specials and imprisoned for 15 years. His mother had had a breakdown and had been hospitalized. He had been responsible for bringing up 8 children. His sister, right after him, had become a drug addict and ultimately committed suicide from depression. And his brother had been kneecapped and had remained unemployed ever since. So he told this story. We don't have much time. I won't go on. He finally finished the cigarette. It was probably the longest short story ever told, and certainly the longest cigarette ever smoked. And when he finished his story, there was a silence. And he waited for the gun to go off, and the gun didn't go off. Eventually, with his free hand that had smoked the cigarette, he unbound himself, looked around, and there was nobody there. So he told this story, and as he did, a man stood up at the back of the room. There was about 30 ex-paramilitaries, Republican and Loyalist. And he said, I was your assassin. And he said, I was about to shoot you. But when I heard your story, I didn't shoot you because I realized your story was my story. And it struck me that there was something terribly important there in the movement from hostility to hospitality, the sharing of the cigarette, the sharing of smoke, the touching of the hand with the hand, the telling of the story blindfolded, very important, led to an impossible moment where caritas, or maybe empathy, won out over murder. And often when I saw in Northern Ireland, you've all seen similar pictures in newsreels, of the famous handshakes, John Hume with Gerry Adams, Hume with Trimble, the Queen of England, God knows, with Martin McGuinness, the head of the IRA. These impossible handshakes, I do not believe, could have taken place in the symbolic and political and constitutional way in which they subsequently did, if it wasn't for those handshakes where radical hostility converted somehow to hospitality. Given the root of both terms, being hostis, the same. Enemy can mean guest. And this is not true of just the Latin, it's true of the Greek, it's true of the Old German, as Benveniste points out in his Indo-European Language and Society. The same word for enemy at the root of hostility and guest at the root of hospitality. So it seems to me that the wages and the wagers of empathy are huge. And the question of how we acknowledge the other's difference. There was no problem between these two prisoners. They killed each other because of religious, cultural, economic, and ethnic differences. But how in difference can we nonetheless acknowledge the stranger as another me? So I want to make basically 2 points, one phenomenological and the other theological, beginning with phenomenology in Edith Stein, who has been cited in the 2 lectures by Rowan Williams. Edith Stein, as many of you know, was the disciple, student, and assistant of Edmund Husserl, and her work on empathy in 1916, published in 1917, her doctoral thesis, was at a time when she was working very closely with her master, Edmund Husserl. And in 1918, he finished, and she transcribed his major work, Ideas 2, in which, in the second part, chapter 3, he enunciates the first phenomenology of empathy, borrowing very, very generously from Edith Stein, and there was this dialogue between them. But what he basically points out in that particular chapter is that touch is at the heart of empathy. Not sight, not vision, but touch. And he quotes De Anima, and he quotes Aristotle, who in De Anima Book 2 says that in spite of the Western metaphysical dominance of sight over the other senses, and sight and sound, he says, in fact, empathy is to be found in touch and taste, the 2 despised senses. The senses that for the physiologists, materialists, and Platonists, as Aristotle points out, were actually despised and maligned and seen as bestial and animal, and leading to basically a dissolution of boundaries between self and other. And Aristotle says, no, the contrary is true. He said, there is mediation in touch. And he says, the medium of touch is flesh. And flesh is metaxu, is a medium, not an organ. So there is no question of an immediacy where I and the other dissolve into one. On the contrary, flesh is the medium of touch where I come into touch with the other for the first time. I discover myself as a distinct self because I touch the other and am touched by the other. So this was, for Aristotle, the basis of what he called intelligence and discrimination, where touch, he says, knows differences. So touch and taste became, for him, in this extraordinary passage, overturning the previous received wisdom, the basis of empathy and of intelligence. And of course, sapientia, as you know, the word for wisdom comes from sapere, to taste, savourer, savoir, savvy, to be savvy. And Aristotle plays on that, but also on, and I'm riffing there on the English and the French, obviously, as it comes from sapientia, but also on tact and contact. There is no contact, no immediacy without tact. And to have tact is to have intelligence, is to be able to distinguish differences even in what seems to be the most immediate. So when we get Husserl citing Aristotle, and of course Edith Stein came through the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition also, but when you find them talking about touch, it is this double sensation. It's not sensation at a distance like sight and hearing that came to dominate in our Western culture. It actually is the reversibility of touching and being touched, which acknowledges connection but also difference. The word Einfühlung suggests ein, that it all comes into one and runs the risk of collapse into sameness. But at the heart of that sameness, there is difference. So, fast forward to the end of that chapter and his basic, Husserl's basic point, that in empathy we find touch, and in touch we find empathy. That tradition, the phenomenological tradition, went in 2 directions. One direction, Scheler and Merleau-Ponty, emphasized the reversibility of touching and being touched. You can see without being seen. You can hear without being heard. You cannot touch without being touched. So we're at our most vulnerable in that very moment of touch, our most exposed to alterity and otherness. And that, he maintained, that double sensation is what makes us ultimately intelligent and human and tender-skinned, as Aristotle says. The tender-skinned, the soft-skinned are the people who discriminate most, are most sensitive, therefore are most sensible, therefore are most intelligent, therefore potentially are the most philosophical. So he was turning the hierarchy around. And Husserl does the same thing, and two different strands emerge from this. One, which is basically a phenomenology of auto-affection, and that stresses reversibility and symmetry between me and the other. That's Scheler in his essays on sympathy, and Merleau-Ponty, what he calls the chiasms of touch, where I am touched and touched at the same time. Then the other tradition takes another angle on this, and I think Stein is sort of at the axis, but it stresses the alterity, the non-primordial, asymmetrical, non-reversible relationship with the other who I touch and who touches me. And this comes from Husserl's basic understanding, and Rowan Williams mentioned this yesterday, that there is something in our relationship with the other that always remains irreducible, inappropriable. And Aristotle said the nearest we can get in empathy is what he called transfer by analogy. But as soon as you've got analogy that I, me, experiencing myself in what he called my live, my sensing body, my lived immediacy, I'm like the person over there who experiences as a he, she, you, their experience as I experience mine. The closest we can get, he said, is what he called pairing and analogy. But in that, there is an irrecuperable other. Levinas picks up this point. The other, the ethical relationship, is always with another that is inappropriable and asymmetrical. And Derrida, of course, takes it to the ultimate, and some might argue absurd conclusion of the absolute other that upsets any notion in its heteroaffection of what he calls autoaffection, or haptocentrism, which he accuses Merleau-Ponty of. So there's a whole debate that goes on in phenomenology based on this extremely important little text by Husserl, who is in dialogue with Edith Stein, on the nature of empathy, Einfühlung, and how it brings us to the other through touch, and then also allows the other constantly to escape. What I want to do in the remaining few minutes is say a word about the empathic God. The Buddha, when he was asked, or when he was challenged rather, by Mara, on what authority can you speak of suffering? What do you know about suffering? He didn't say anything. He touched the ground with his hand. And then he practiced the sensation of breathing, the pranayama tradition. So it was touch of breath and touch of ground that answered that question about feeling. In the Abrahamic tradition, where does hospitality first begin? Arguably in the scene where Abraham tastes food with the three strangers who come out of the desert, and under the mamre tree, hostility, they could be killed, they could be killers, turns into hospitality, they share food. And the impossible act of hospitality becomes the impossible act of birthing and rebirthing the impossible child, Isaac, meaning laughter in Hebrew, because this could not be. She was sterile and Abraham was 365. It was not going to happen, but it happened. The impossible happened through taste, through sapientia, through savvy and tact. Jacob and the angel, the revelation of God as Israel, is through tact, touch, the mutual touching and struggling, difference and connection between Jacob and the angel. Christianity, the welcoming of the stranger by Mary, Gabriel, and the impossible, adunatan, it is not possible that I conceive the child, becomes the possible. And many of the depictions of the scene, as you know, there is a light that enters Mary very often through the ear. The light enters her, but it is a touching. The life of Jesus. What is the life of Jesus? Well, as my good friend, the Greek Orthodox monk John Manisakis put it, the life of Jesus is about two things. He came on earth. The Word became flesh for two reasons, to touch and to taste. Touching. The touching of the blind man with the spittle and the mud. Thomas touching him as he returns from the dead. The Phoenician woman who goes to him and says, will you touch my child and heal my child? And Jesus says, no, you're a Phoenician woman. She was a stranger. And Jesus says, but you're feeding the dogs. You're having this meal. You're feeding the dogs crumbs. Could I have a crumb? I'm a Phoenician woman. Can I have a crumb? And Jesus says, good on you. And he learns to be Christ from the strange woman. She's the Christ who teaches him how to be Christ. Because she says, I am the stranger, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger all. And when I got a sick son, will you come and heal him? And constantly with the Samaritans, his kind of favorite people, and the Phoenicians, it's with the stranger and the touching and being touched by the stranger that Jesus arguably becomes Christ. Food, let's not even begin, you know. It starts with tasting at Cana and ends with the Last Supper. And then the resurrected Jesus appears in Lake Tiberias and says, come and have breakfast. They don't know who he is because he's a stranger. That's Matthew 25. I'm the stranger who asked for food and water or gave it. And then he asked for food when he appears to them in the closed room. And then, of course, Emmaus. It's in the breaking of the bread, not in the sight or even sound, the sharing of the scriptures. It's in the breaking of the bread and the eating of the bread, which, of course, reprises the three angels appearing to Abraham, that Jesus is revealed. And if with Mary Magdalene he says noli me tangere, it's because there's touch and touch. And there's a touch that holds and clings, and there's a touch that caresses and lets go, lets the other be other. And Jean-Luc Nancy, as some of you may know, has written a beautiful book taking the various depictions and paintings of the noli me tangere scene and showing how in most of them Mary is actually touching Jesus, or she is touching him. But he's talking about another kind of touch. I have not yet gone to the Father, which is another way of saying there must remain a distance in our touching. It's another apprenticeship to touch. So let me end with one final last image, which I know is dear to Rowan Williams, the perichoresis. The three angels reappear in the Andrei Rublev icon, painted in the early 17th century, as one of the canonical images, as many of you know, of the Orthodox tradition. And in that, what do you have representing the three persons of the Trinity? You have the three strangers of Abraham. And what are they doing? They're moving around perichoresis, the kora, which is the chalice of food and wine. They are endlessly moving in a circle, which translated into Latin, forgive this kind of linguistic parenthesis, becomes circumincessio, the moving circum around, which is cedo, the circumincession is to cedo, to leave the place to the other. Each is saying, take my place, is becoming a host to the other as guest. And each is also sedo with an S, s'asseoir, sitting into the place, taking the place left by the guest. It seems to me that is an empathic trinity, in that they are constantly in moving, they are constantly being moved by each other as each sees the place around the center, the gap, the kora, the womb. Mary was described as the kora akoraton in the great icons and murals. The womb that contains kora, the akoraton, the uncontainable. So in that movement of circularity without end, of the infinite in the finite, one finds, I think, an image of hospitality and empathy. And finally, just a footnote, if we get time in the discussion, I'd like to pick up on Emma's point about the virtual world, because it seems to me that if empathy is, as Rowan Williams has suggested, a proper balance between connecting with the other, being like them, but also retaining how I am unlike them, and how different and other and transcendent they remain vis-a-vis us, I would like to ask if in our age of excarnation, empathy might not sometimes need to go more towards touch and taste and away from the distance that places the other too far away in our virtual digital world. Maybe we have, to some extent, lost touch with our touch and our taste in education, in medicine, in sex, in friendship, where more and more our relationships are at a distance rather than hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hollywood.
Thank you. It's
Smell, I hope you're going to talk about smell, touch, taste.
yeah, touch, sight, taste, yeah. I think touches. I think who touches with who is judged as grasping and who is judged as caressing, I think is a question that probably is underlying what I'm going to say. I hope relatively briefly. First, my thanks to Homi for inviting me, and just to say that it is daunting to speak in response to and about Robin Williams, that would be really daunting. Rowan Williams, a man who has grappled intellectually, spiritually, and practically with the concrete issues about which he spoke to us over the past 2 days in a more philosophic mode. And I'm going to continue in a more philosophic mode, but always with that concreteness in the background. I'm going to start with a passage from a novel about science. This, however, is the story of science. A man, that's quite intentional, a man discovers something. He doesn't know what it is or what it's for or what it might solve, but he knows that he has unearthed another piece of a puzzle whose entire shape and picture and form he can only guess. He spends the rest of his life trying to find the next piece, but because he doesn't even know what he's looking for, it's very hard work, and he's unlikely to find a solution. Then comes a man from the next generation. He sees the piece of the puzzle that has been found, and he finds the next. So now there are 2 pieces, and then there are 3, and 4, and 5. But at no point, no matter how many pieces there are, is any one man ever able to say he knows what the puzzle's ultimate shape will reveal. When he thinks he's working toward a picture of a horse, he'll suddenly find a fish's fin and realize he's been wrong all along. Then he thinks he's trying to build an image of a fish, but the next piece that slots into place will be a bird's wing lifted in flight. To be a scientist is to learn to live all one's life with questions that will never be answered, with the knowledge that one was too early or too late, with the anguish of not having been able to guess at the solution that, once presented, seems so obvious that one can only curse oneself for not seeing what one ought to have, if only one had looked in a slightly different direction. These are the words of a very unreliable narrator. First of all, he's a fictional character. First point against him. Ronald Kubadera, Ron, we'll call him, as he calls himself. He appears in Hanya Yanagihari's novel, The People in the Trees, as the editor and commentator on the words of yet another fictional narrator, the ethically compromised, severely ethically compromised, and manifestly unreliable A. Norton Perina. The passage that I just read comes from a footnote to Perina's account of his life that had been sent in a series of letters to Kubadera. This understanding of science, however, seems much closer in spirit to Edith Stein's work on Einfühlung than does the speculative move out of, beyond the scientific, properly scientific sphere undertaken by Simon Baron-Cohen, and perhaps by his work as a brain scientist as well. Brain mapping tells us something, but what? And what do we do with that knowledge? How can we move from the correlation between reported or observed states of mind or feeling and the firing of neurons in particular portions of the brain to claims about the causal connections between these coterminous events? What role does the telling and the observing play? And how might the terms in which this telling and observing occur fundamentally change what it is we think we know when we see neurons firing at particular moments? How can I know that what I sense or feel in my body and what another senses or feels in hers are the same? Surely, in some crucial way, they are not. Good science is based in part on recognizing and exploring, even as it attempts to overcome, that difference. And so the very science in which Baron-Cohen rests his claim to solving the problem of evil is fraught with properly scientific problems. Nicholas points to the fact that we were having the humanist defensiveness. It's not just a humanist defensiveness. On scientific grounds, there are fundamental problems with the kinds of arguments he makes, as far as I understand it from my readings in philosophy of science. As Williams rightly observes, any analysis of empathy and brain functioning more broadly inevitably brings us back to, quote, our inescapable failures in communication. This is because it begins with the very posing of the question in scientific work. What is empathy? What observable states or first-person accounts qualify as properly empathic? How do we come to trust what we see is what we claim it is? That what we say we feel is, in fact, what we feel? That what a scientific subject says she feels is, in fact, what she feels? So there is a problem for me with the work of Baron Cohen, even before we get to the issues raised again by Williams of the problematic desire for a general theory that can forgo the labor of learning within the world of word and image that we constitute over time in our interactions. That last phrase is from Williams. I'll come back to that. The continually recursive structure of thought and feeling described by Edith Stein, by Stanley Cavell, and for us this week by Williams, is continually enacted in Yanagihara's novel through the voices of Ron Cobadera, Norton Perina, and the others whose words they recount. How accurately we can only try painstakingly and never with any finality to discover. And then there are the newspaper stories, again, of course, fictional, that open and close the novel. Before we read a word by Ron Cobadera or Norton Perina, we know, in that odd form of knowing that is the as-if of fiction, that Perina is a Nobel Prize-winning medical research scientist, adoptive father of 43 children, all orphans or sons and daughters of impoverished parents from the Micronesian islands on which he made his greatest discovery. And we learn that Norton Perina has been accused, convicted, and sent to prison for rape and child endangerment. Yanagihara's novel begins with a fictionalized version of a true story. In 1996, the Nobel Prize-winning medical researcher Daniel Carlton Gadashik, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, was accused of molesting one of the 56 mostly male children he adopted, legally or unofficially remains unclear, from the South Pacific, again, from the place where he had done some of his most important work. He confessed and was convicted in 1997. He spent 12 months in jail. He then moved to Norway, where he died in 2004, I believe. I know only the barest outline of the story, and it is all that Yanagihara needs, or that we need to understand a crucial aspect of her novel. This is not the time to offer a full reading of The People in the Trees, even if I was capable of giving one, although the resonances with Williams' work are striking, if unsettling. For many scientists, the puzzles they work on, according to this narrative, in her narrative, the scientists within this narrative, I should say, the puzzles they work on are in principle solvable. Eventually, the various eyes and minds and hands and noses and ears working on the problem will solve it, although the contours of that solution may look wildly different from any earlier workers' imaginings. This does not mean that the early scientists' work did not matter. In fact, it is central to the final resolution of the puzzle, and that's what makes the scientific enterprise so exciting for these characters in this novel, that they're contributing to the working out of a puzzle, even if the way they've gone about it turns out to be completely wrong-headed. Yet Williams poses a more intense challenge to the cognitive scientist, at least implicitly, for if what we can know about the human mind depends in some way on either self-reporting or observation of putative emotional and cognitive states, are we not always already within the hermeneutical frame, one in which communication will always, to some extent, fail? Are there not aspects of human experience that will never and can never be fully known? Me, myself, in my ever-changing body, the other bodies by which I am constituted and to which I am subject, often, and here I would press on something to which Williams alludes, but to which he doesn't draw undue attention, in exceedingly dangerous ways. Yanagihara's novel rests in this space of vulnerability, both that of the people of a fictional Micronesian island destroyed by the incursion of Western medicine and capitalism, but also that of the scientist who, perhaps inadvertently, and in the pursuit of what he takes to be an unquestioned good, in the novel its immortality, helps bring about the destruction of those people and those islands. As Williams asked himself the other day, who are we? That question takes on particular salience in light of Williams' claim that imaginative alertness and emotional literacy are developed in emotionally secure families and in well-constructed programs of humanistic education. I'm citing from yesterday's paper here. Emotional and cultural security, he writes, form the background for that necessary and radical self-questioning from which the empathic stance, in the full sense we have been seeking to trace, requires what is demanded by the sheer weight and seriousness of the impenetrable other. Yet the moral center of Yanagihara's novel is a young boy traded to Perina for a piece of fruit and a penknife, destitute, starving, covered with open sores, infections, and filth. Perina tries, in his own words, to make him human. But Victor, for that's the name, laced with corrosive irony, Perina gives to him. Victor refuses all but the most superficial of Perina's ministrations. The final, long, violent conflict revolves around his name. Purina insists on Victor, V on V. Is this a reference to bare life, the claim that bare life is better than the victory of civilization on offer from Purina? Or is V insisting that mere life is never mere life? In the absence of security, you are always questioning yourself, questioning others, questioning the relationships between. The powerless know. They often take care of the bodies of the powerful when they are at their most vulnerable. They learn to read the faces, the voices, the stance of the powerful, because their very lives depend on it. And yet that stance can never be one of trust, never one purely of trust. Trust is earned laboriously and painfully. Attained and broken, all hell breaks loose. In a destructive and self-destructive fury that tends to engender little empathy and even less understanding. My question to Williams, and this is inchoate still, because I'm not sure where he was going entirely in terms of what stood in place of, or as a supplement to, not in place of, as a supplement to empathy, which I totally agree that empathy alone is not enough, right? And we need something. But is law enough to protect against this rage and the conditions that engender it? Is not law itself violent? Is not law itself a form of rage? Or can it not be a form of rage? Are we not always in danger of it becoming so? These lead to questions about the darkness of the human heart, as well as about its wings. They lead me to questions about, and I'm going to leave this to people on the floor, I know some people have these questions, about what possible place something like psychoanalysis might have for the kind of political work that Williams is engaged in here. To Gillian Rose, I posed the question of her sister Jacqueline Rose and what role her appeals to psychoanalysis might play. And finally, I think it opens a question that I'm going to just leave on the table because I know people have questions about it, and I'm glad that Nicholas and Richard both brought it up. And that is the question about theology and whether a God who is so protected from human empathy, as it sounds at times like you're interested in maintaining, is a God who is going to be experienced as anything other than violent.
Amy,
Thank
you. Thank you. Thank you all very much for these really remarkable responses. I will just very quickly run through some of the keywords here, literally like that, just to start up the conversation and to create a sense of a kind of common sense in this room. I'll be very selective, but I'll be quick. I think one of the most interesting issues here is that everybody, that all, at least most of you, came with a story, with a narrative, with some kind of conversational, exemplary moment. And I think that bodes really rather well for the links between narrative narrative, empathy, and literature or art, or the representational the representational knowledges, if I might put it. It was a wonderful way in which something else was added to the kind of issues here, and why empathy should elicit quite often the necessity of the story, of the shared narrative. It seemed to me to be very interesting. Nicholas then, through the work of Morrison, I Am Not You, asked us to, that in the midst of this recursivity, to actually think about history and use the kind of medieval moment to talk about empathy and to make us rethink it. And the various conjugations of I am not you, its use of negations linked to a historical view, I think was very, very, very interesting. Emma Rothschild's reflections on Adam Smith raised the question, I thought very powerfully, of strategy and scale through the question of empathy, and the importance, again, of the question of conversation, and the ways in which, by scaling up from empathy, or scaling down, or scaling sideways maybe, towards a form of proximity, one could think actually about teaching and learning, and about, in the most general sense, the fate and future of the university and what we do here. Richard then took up this question of conversation from Emma, and told us his very touching and shocking story, both touching and shocking, the IRA story, and then went on to do a kind of very astounding philology of the ethics and the metaphysics of both touch and taste. Very fascinating, and also distracted us from the hegemony of the visual in our relations, and gave me at least a sense of what I call in my work the side-by-side, where the touching and the tangibility of touching and tasting is, I think, much stronger. And Amy then again, by using the novel and the literary text, and this opening moment of the puzzle that is always vanishing, and which is always both virtual and actually at some level established, that game of the puzzle, that the imminent puzzle always being completed, and yet having necessarily to have a missing puzzle, problematized the notion of general theory, of what a general theory is, and then took up the question of emotional literacy and cultural security from Rowan Williams's talks, to pose a question that I have also wanted to ask: where is psychoanalysis in all of this, in the midst of this phenomenology? But then, Amy, I think you also raised the question of empathy, acknowledging both the violence of enunciation and the violence of the law, but asking for some sense of justice or fairness to be established in the discourse. That's my imperfect but spontaneous summing up of some of the major issues of this afternoon's discussion. Thank you all very much. Rowan, on to you.
Goodness, thank you. What I'd like to do, if I may, is select just a very small number of issues that have come up, because I would like to hear from the wider audience. But first of all, to say the most heartfelt thank you to my fellow discussants and to all those who've been part of this week's conversation. I've been deeply privileged to be part of this exploration, and I've found myself stretched in all sorts of directions. So this will be a very brief and inadequate picking up of a few themes to see if I can join up some of those things which Homi has foregrounded and which others have underlined. Just one word on the historical hinterland of some of the language and some of the discussion that we've been involved in, and that's to go back even further to Augustine. To me, one of the most interesting passages in the whole of Augustine's Confessions is in the fourth book, where he describes his experience of a friend's death when he was a teenager. Obviously a passage familiar to many of you. I see nods around the room. But Augustine's intense reflection in the chapters that follow on what he felt in bereavement, and how difficult he found it to disentangle grief for the other from grief for himself, how in that process, as he says, quaestio facta sum mihi, I became a question to myself, I became a puzzle to myself. I think that is one of the most interesting texts in, if you like, setting in motion some of the issues that I and we have been trying to reflect on this week. In what ways does grief for the other become compulsively absorbed back into grief for myself? And there's a long, but I think fairly serious trajectory of connection between Augustine's discussion there and, since we've mentioned psychoanalysis, Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, which really does tackle much the same kind of aporia. That's just a note on the background, and a note which I think says something about the very notion of the I that works here. One observation I have, which I think connects with both Nicholas and Emma's questions and challenges. I found myself thinking in response to Nicholas about the long tradition in not just Christian, but let's stick with Christian for the moment, discourse about pity, a word which now, of course, we don't much like using because it has all sorts of baggage connected with it. And found myself asking, therefore, what is it that we like about a word like empathy and we don't like about a word like pity? Compassion sometimes seems to go the same way as pity these days, and I suspect that the popularity of empathy as a word is that it has not yet had time to come down in the world in the way that pity and compassion has. Give it time. But I suspect that one of the things we might want to say about pity is that it doesn't carry with it very much sense of being deprived by the other's privation. It doesn't have very much sense that I am less myself because you are less yourself or we are less ourselves. And that perhaps that is one of the key ideas that we're all trying to find a way into here. Because that immediately related for me to Emma's challenge about how we talk in the intermediate level between the personal and the market or the social sphere. And I found myself thinking about what some have called the civic imagination, where you can translate something of that point about the privation of others being the privation of myself into a language perhaps about the security of the other being the security of myself. The other who is secured, who has guaranteed recognition, who has licit claim, however you want to put it, the security of that other is something to do with my own security in the proper sense. And that, I think, is where one might want to begin making some sort of connection. And some sort of connection also with Amy's question. Security is something which we are inclined to respond to worries about by exclusionary tactics, by scapegoating tactics, by reassuring tactics, by blame, by any number of strategies which we're extremely familiar with in our personal lives and in our public and political lives. The word security, very often when introduced into a discussion of public ethics, means so often a debasing of the ethical quality of that discussion. And we know it in the UK as you know it in this country, I dare say. So I want to see if we can't do something to reclaim notions of security in terms precisely of the other's privation being mine, the fundamental point about a social and an international ethic having to do with that recognition and assurance of what I called licit claim a moment ago, guaranteed voice, that has something to do with how we translate an empathic stance of the kind I was outlining into public policy and even international relations, which is why I do take very much what Amy said about whether law is enough to protect against the rage of injustice or pain, and whether that's another kind of violence. When I used Gillian Rose's reflections on law, I think it was very much in the light of the way she sees law as the essence of this securing of the other. The point about the legal other is that their standing is not at my mercy, at my disposal. And that proper dispossession of the of my absolute liberty, that proper recognition of the other's assurance, whatever it might cost my fantasies, that becomes something which, in principle, pushes back against all varieties of violence without overcoming it definitively, and yet always challenging or relativizing it. I'd love to say more about the role of psychoanalysis in all this, because it's something which is very close to my heart, and Jacqueline Rose is someone I revere almost as much as Gillian Rose, I'd want to say more about that, but time is a little short, so if I'm allowed just one or two more very, very brief thoughts. One in response to Richard on that wonderful image of authority, the Buddhist image by what authority and the touching. That's partly to say, isn't it, that authoritative utterance is recognized as such when we see, in the very literal sense, common ground, the establishing of common ground and common groundedness is something without which we can't recognize or deal with or negotiate authority. Hence, theologically speaking, the importance, which I fully recognize, of speaking about the encounter with God as tactile, as something to do with the history of emotional subjects, affective subjects, above all, paradigmatically, centrally, the subject who is Jesus of Nazareth. And that still leaves me with some uncertainties about the empathic God, as I keep coming back to this one. I think I'd want to say to Amy that the very phrase, a God protected from human empathy, begs the question. Because it assumes that the classical passionlessness of God is a privation, whereas the God who has no agenda is supremely the God who is beyond violence, because having no place to defend, having no interest to argue. But I was very struck with Nicholas's question about how that might play into the environmental issue. And I need to think a bit more about that, but just a thought on the hoof about it. It seems to me that I'd want to start off with an environmental theological ethic by saying as robustly as I could that it is grounded in the common ground of finitude, what we are together in a world of limits and intersecting interconnecting limitednesses. And that for that to work as fully and effectively as it can, it's quite a help to say that there is a radical difference between the limitless and the limited, and that radical difference, which involves God's love of what is utterly unlike God in certain important respects, paradoxically, once again, leads us to see that within our own intersecting limits, our own less radical forms of otherness in relationship carry the same weight and the same demand for recognition across boundaries as the love between God and what is not God. But that's, let's say, thinking out loud, and I need to think more about it. I just drop it in for the moment, and I better shut up at this point and let some people ask some questions.
On that last point, on the ecological point, you have actually written, I thought, very interestingly on the problem of scarcity.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that, when you talk about the limits, in that, if you could just say a couple of words about that, there was... on the ethics of scarcity.
Yes. Two things which run side by side, I think, in our reflection, our ethical reflection about the environment. One is what I've already said about the ethic of limit. We are not capable of limitless growth. We are not capable of the limitless exercise of power over our bodies, our others, and our non-human others. At the same time, we take refuge very often in a rhetoric of scarcity. There's not enough to go around, so we ought to be panicking. So rather than ask, what is it that goes around? What do we have to go around? What is it that's shareable? We begin by saying scarcity. We begin by saying threat, rather than abundance, rather than gratitude. And that in itself carries an ethical freight.
Thank you very much. I think I'm now going to open up to questions. If we can have a show of hands, you will have our brave mic runner running to you. But yeah, please say just very briefly who you are. Yeah.
I don't know.
And sorry, before you start, can I just remind you to ask? Could I just remind you, questions are short sentences with a question mark at the end.
It's a novel idea.
I'll aspire to that. My name's Charles Stang. My question has to do with an earlier book of yours, Professor Williams, that will circle back to the lectures you just gave. Your book on Arius. You end that book by saying that one of the distinctive features of Nicene orthodoxy, or the way to see the contest between Nicene orthodoxy and Arius, is a contest between how to relate intimacy and alterity. And that Arius wants to banish alterity so as to preserve God's transcendence, but that Nicene orthodoxy insists on the coincidence of alterity and intimacy. It struck me, actually, listening to you speak in the last few days, that your lectures on empathy are circling around exactly that same set of questions from a different point of view. I trust that that is not an accident, and that because Homi is looking at me and wants a
Excellent question.
Mark,
I don't want this question
I will
spoiled.
say simply, would you please comment on
Thank you.
the coincidence?
Thank you very much. Absolutely right, in fact. I think that the alterity-intimacy interaction is something that has always preoccupied me as a theological issue. And it can be put in a number of different ways and registers, I think. I'm fascinated by the way in which, for example, in Christian scripture, it's configured sometimes as the tension between dependence and authority, as spelled out in the fourth gospel. The figure we're presented with in the fourth gospel is both one who is wholly receiving from a radically other, the Father, in the fourth gospel, and one in whom there is life and authority, because of an intimacy that is deeper than any categories we can bring to it. And it's just that kind of issue which bears, I think, in this context in the same way. And yes, it's, for me, an interesting and a quite significant part of my entire sense of an intellectual project, insofar as I have one, that some of these tensions we spell out in speaking about God are the tensions we spell out in speaking about ourselves, and ourselves in relation to whatever we're not. So you're absolutely right to see the connection there, and I'm delighted that it's been spotted. So thank you.
People in the
Could you just introduce yourself?
Elaine Scarry. People in the public health world, I'm thinking of one person in particular, Hugh McDermott at Cornell Medical, make the distinction between narrative compassion and statistical compassion, and point out that however good we are at narrative compassion, and some people would say we're very good and some people would say we're not so good, however good we are at that, we're much, much less well-practiced in statistical compassion. And I know that both close-range empathy and distant statistical empathy have been important part of these lectures. In, for example, the difference between the photograph of a child who's hungry and the agricultural picture, or in the difference between law and feeling. But I'm just wondering if maybe I'm just asking for some kind of summary of what the bridge is between them. To some extent, it can seem as though the things that work in the close range practice of empathy and a kind of almost veil of soul making can't really translate to the number of people to whom we're responsible in public life, in political life, because often they're not even within our visual horizon, let alone our sensory, our touch horizon, much as I revere that the way Richard does. They're not within our touch horizon unless we're trying to reach them with weapons. And it seems to me not impossible that the conclusions that obtain in one realm could be transferred to the other realm. I can illustrate that, but I just wondered how far we've gotten with the bridge between those two.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That is indeed a very central preoccupation in what I've been trying to reflect on. And as I said the other day, a not entirely academic one for me as chair of trustees of a large international development charity. I'm fascinated by that cliche compassion fatigue, which I think I mentioned briefly. It suggests, doesn't it, that compassion is something we ought to be feeling very intensely, and we know we can't. And we feel very bad about the fact that we don't feel as sorry as we ought to. And part of me wants to come in and say, it's not about how you feel. It's really about, let's say, an emotionally informed intelligence and an emotionally informed imagination. We tend to think that authentic response to suffering has as its paradigm case an intense sense of suffering with or suffering for or whatever. And we feel sometimes we failed when we don't produce that, or we conclude if we're not feeling that, there's nothing we really need to do. Or we just feel compassion fatigue and say, enough is enough, I can't bear any more pictures of starving children. Now, I want to put a very large question mark over all of that and say, and get us back a little bit to the civic imagination once again. What does it mean to recognize, yes, with some affect, not absolutely coldly, but to recognize as a routine part of how I see myself and sense myself, the inter-involvement of my security, my well-being with that of others. And that, I think, is something which it ought to be possible to educate ourselves in a bit without assuming that it is all about the cultivation of feeling. So I'm trying to poise here on a bit of a knife edge between what I think is often to use a word I've used more than once this week, the disturbing sentimentality that we can bring to this, and a chilly and arm's length response. I think statistical compassion, to use that helpful phrase, can still be compassion. That is, a sense that I am affected by the pain and privation of another. A recognition that what is going on there is my business. But there's more than one way of things being my business. And if I assume that the primary or paradigm way of its being my business is that I feel terrible about it, then the point will come where I want to cut off or I want to back away. And that's what I mustn't do, because I remain, if you like, ontologically involved here. So how do we cultivate in ourselves that imagining of involvement without reducing it, and I think it is a reduction, to felt solidarity? There is solidarity that is real and not felt in the same way all the time, and that's, I guess that's an important factor of our solidarity with, again, with the environment. You know, the sense that privation is my business.
Emma, do you want to respond to that?
Well, just to say that this does seem to me to be the central question in lots of different respects, and it's the sort of sense that there are collective institutions which ensure security goes across quite a wide range of security institutions. I mean, for Smith, it was the equal and impartial administration of justice. But one could think about the institutions that make the economic system secure, that it's in everybody's interest to have some well-respected economic regulations, so that it's again the same point about imagining something that's between the individual and the larger structure, but not only on the basis of the emotional response precisely of the individual, which is why it's not the same as compassion. To say that you need the world as it is plus compassion doesn't get you anywhere to what Rowan is talking about.
I think Hannah Arendt actually makes an interesting distinction between the ontological, what is, sort of things we've been talking about around the ethical, and agency. And the agent, an agency is what mediates in that space. The notion of the agent is different simply from the ontological. And I think that's one way in which you can reach the sort of scale you're talking about, to scale at the institution level. My question to you yesterday also was, what about empathy and institutions? Is the church an empathic institution, or which period? So I think there is something there that needs to come through, and I think Arendt might be a useful way of thinking about it.
Just a quick point on that, and coming back to Elaine's point about how do we bridge the statistical compassion with kind of hands-on, tactile compassion. And I was just thinking of Euryclea touching Odysseus' scar, right? He comes home, nobody recognizes him except for her when she touches, well, the dog does too, through Flair, but she touches his scar. But as she's touching the scar of his wound, and his name, Odysseus, is the one who bears suffering, she tells the story. The story is told. And it seems to me that narrative imagination is crucial in bridging the gap between sort of the more universal and abstract. It allows for distance, or what Aristotle calls fear, right, Bhabha, as well as touching the scar. And the purgation of pity and fear in narrative seems to me to be very important here. If you have too much pity, and I think Rowan is constantly and rightly cautioning us against this, there's a pathology of pathos, right, an overwhelming sort of nearness. And you need the farness of the phobia to pull us back from Elias. And then you get the purging of the emotions through mythos mimesis. But if you don't have the mythos mimesis, you're either going to have too much distance or too much nearness. And I think it's not an accident that Homi said we all, in our different ways, without having a concerted meeting about this, talked stories. And somewhere it bridges the universal and the singular. No?
But, would there be a story that could have helped Odysseus abstain from massacring the suitors and all the handmaids? I've always thought, I think, along the lines of that Ron Williams was describing Gillian Rose's work, that law had to be behind. So the law was, I don't care whether you like this person or don't like them, you're not allowed to do X, Y, and Z, or this population. But maybe just listening to this debate today, I thought that, maybe if you had a law, a rule, that, okay, we're going to say that under certain circumstances you're going to be able to slaughter another population. You seem habitually to like to do. But before you do that, you're going to have to, this is following Emma's empathy spray and you're touching me, you're going to have to have the whole civilian population kind of pass by each other the way basketball players do at the end of the game, just for a minute touch, but then if you still think you can do this, or maybe have a month or a year devoted to hearing stories about them, like Lolita and Devon or something.
But your opening story actually speaks to this issue, because the guy was not being killed for himself individually. He was being killed because he was the representative of a part of a group. And that's the scale issue.
And what
private cross
Yeah.
each other.
And what comes through in that story, of course, is somebody recognizing as the narrative is told, not just this, my story is your story, but my privation is your privation.
Correct.
I mean, I can't help wanting to hear about all the times somebody told a story and they still got shot in the head. I mean, this is, you know, I don't.
Yeah, but they didn't tell it right.
Okay, if that's what you
The
say.
mythos mimesis has to be very
Yeah,
carefully
yeah.
done.
I just wanted to say one quick thing to bring back something Nicholas had said, and then I go back. My question is I think whether if you push away the empathic God, or you know protect, you say you're not protecting because God is beyond protection, but is that to sit too far on the side of the apophasis and not allow the cataphatic to come in, so that the loving God, right, who can be experienced as tremendously violent in the Middle Ages, 4 degrees of loving God, Richard of St. Victor, amongst others, you know, but that God who is apophatically removed from loving is also experienced as can be experienced as a kind of violence. So one of the questions about the empathic God, which I'm not all that comfortable with either, but some language about love and need on the part of God in relationship to humanity, isn't that part of that dialectic that, as Nicholas rightly pointed out, often modern theologians and others leave out one half of the apophatic-cataphatic divide, you know, and don't leave that paradox in place.
I've just been reading a piece by John Milbank, which accuses me most effectively and eloquently of
I really don't like to be saying the same thing John Milbank
being
said.
being overcommitted to the apophatic.
Interesting.
I'd probably better say I do believe that God loves us.
You do believe what?
That God loves us.
Next question, please.
Yeah.
Now that you feel secure in God's love, you can ask any question you like.
My name is Matthew Potts. I teach at the Divinity School here, and I have another question of theology, particularly around the issue of sacrifice. From your lecture yesterday, Lord Williams, I was struck by your account of Julian Rose's critique of Simone Weil and Levinas, insofar as, in particular, I should say, and that what is sacrificed in the account that she gives it's not this sort of self-annihilation, but it's rather what is sacrificed, I think you say, is the imagination of some mutual self-transparency, and that this sacrifice actually gives rise to lawfulness. And so it's not that the law demands sacrifice, but rather that sacrifice gives rise to lawfulness. And as a theologian, I can't help but want you to comment upon what relation this might have to theologies of the Incarnation, to the sacrifice of Christ, to theologies of atonement. And because I teach the sacraments here at Harvard, I was actually wondering if Professor Kearney would or just to highlight some of what he said about the sacrifice of the Mass and this unique presence and absence, which is mediated through touch and taste, and which is called a host. And so, therefore, both a gracious and a dangerous presence.
If you go on any longer, you would have answered your own question.
He was finished.
Thank you very much. Yes, I guess that what Julian Rose is going for in Simone Weil is what I've always found the most deeply ambivalent element in that wonderful thinker, which is expressed for me in the chilling observation in her notebooks. When someone loves me, I think they've made a mistake. There cannot be a coexistence of infinite love and me. The only way in which infinite love can be is for me not to be. That's a really profound theme in Simone Weil, and it does cast some light on her hatred, it's not too strong a word, of her Jewishness and of her body. And while there are many, many other things in Simone Weil that are going on, that remains a really, baffling, problematic, and I find disturbing element in her. It has got me into trouble in the past with some Simone Weil enthusiasts, but I think the texts are there, and one can't just brush them aside. So, obviously, I think you're saying that one mustn't reduce sacrifice to that model of a self-cancellation. And that's where I suppose one has to recover that primitive sense of sacrifice as gift. Sacrifice as peacemaking gift. to use the phrase I've sometimes used in sacramental theology, a peacemaking gift, which is not placating someone else, but again, the creation of common ground by initiating exchange. Common ground, once again, back to what we were saying earlier. Hospitality creates common ground, but it begins with an offer. The paradox of that within the Christian theological system is that we think we are, as it were, establishing the common ground by offering the gift to God. We say simultaneously it is God who gives the primordial gift that allows us to enter God's common ground. So sacrifice giving rise to lawfulness, it's an interesting phrase, and I think there's some mileage in that, insofar as the creation of common ground, the exchange of gift, is precisely that beginning of the marking out of the space in which the other is secure, recognized as giver or receiver or both. And let's not go into Girard just yet, but thank you.
If I could just add a quick note to that. The touch and the taste in the Eucharist, I think, is terribly important. And Aquinas, I'm no Thomist, far from it, but he says that taste is the most important sense for the human-divine relationship because it's the most intimate, that it goes right to our depths, and therefore that is why, for him, the Eucharist is such a privileged medium. And I think also Shaler's, some of Max Shaler's remarks about the Eucharist as the choice of the most ordinary, quotidian of materials, the most material of things, that is so often discarded bread. It's not gold, it's not, some shining, precious thing or substance. It's the simplest of all things that can become the most sacred. And it is the act of hospitality again, that it's in the sharing of the food. So that would be one thing. And then sacrifice, and maybe, yes, to say a word about Girard. For all his sort of monochromatic readings of everything, everything becomes Girard and mimetic desire and bloodletting. Exactly. But I think he has a very, very legitimate point in basically saying that the Eucharist, the Mass, that ritual can be the sacrifice as gift and as service, rather than as bloodletting. And I really do think that there's something very important going on that started with, Abraham on Mount Moriah, do not kill your son, blood sacrifice, receive your son as a gift. And I think the Mass is maybe a repetition of Mount Moriah, as you move from Elohim that says kill to Yahweh of mercy that says don't kill. That's going on each time. And one last thing, my mentor in Paris, Paul Ricoeur, a good Protestant hermeneutic philosopher, said to me once, he said, he used to partake of both Catholic and Protestant Eucharists, but he said, I often think of the Eucharist as something reversible, that instead of seeing it as, bread and wine becoming body and blood, what if body and blood as pain and suffering is being converted, transubstantiated into bread and wine? In other words, non-violence and non-suffering and the aspiration for the sharing of food and drink.
I wonder what you would say. You talked about the quotidian nature of, the bread and so on. But what would you say of very elaborate meals cooked in the name of particular saints or in the name of particular? Is that all the sort of drapery and tracery of the institution rather than the essence of things? I call that a
Homi Bhabha meal.
I haven't cooked for you yet, but that's in the Parsi in Parsi prayer. You have entire meals of very specific kinds of things. Hindu, as you know, and amongst the Hindus too, highly cooked sweets of very particular kinds of Japanese too. So I just was wondering, when you talked about this kind of rather stoic and simple meal, what the actual elaborate cultural nature.
But Homi, do you know how? Well,
those who are hungry, bread is more precious than gold, right?
Yeah, you're right. And every time I try to diet, I feel that. I give up anything, but I don't give up bread.
But there's also 100 ways of cooking bread. I mean, look at French pâtisserie and boulangerie. I mean,
Yeah,
As
but-
Aristotle says, refinement comes from the wine taster and the cuisine of multiple tasting of simple.
Yeah, I just wanted to get off the quotidian thing.
All right.
Okay. Can we have one more question? No more questions.
Homi, I just
One
wanted,
more
I just
question.
wanted to
Yes.
make a point about what I think one might see as a divergence in two strands that's emerged here. Because on the one hand, we've been talking about story, and on the other hand, we've been talking about touch and taste.
Yes.
And with the Eucharist, we bring in, I suppose it's a sort of story, but it's really a ritual.
Yeah.
And I wonder if narrative is always the best. It's a much valorized, much idealized, always mentioned in these contexts. The thing that fixes the problem is if people tell their stories. What if we said instead of the thing that fixes the problem if people perform the appropriate ritual? That actually gets us out of the narrative space, and it also gets us into gesture, which is mediated. It's halfway between the seen and the touched. It's multi-sensory. So I just wanted to.
I think that's an
mention
excellent
that.
point,
Yeah.
actually, Nicholas. And my point about the more elaborate
Yes, I
meal,
love you all over it, but of course I do.
meal making is about using objects
Yes.
for that kind of duration.
Doing the actual cooking.
Doing the actual thing, yeah.
Yes, could I come in on that? I share the wariness of just praying narrative in aid in the way we often use the word narrative, but one of the things that strikes me in thinking about Christian practice, and I think other kinds of religious practice, is the difference between just ritual and what I'd call liturgy. Ritual is ways of doing things. Liturgy is a process by which you get from point A to point B, which is verbal, gestural, involves motion, may involve, as it were, dance, may involve taking, breaking, eating, shifting around. It has a narrative structure in that it's got a beginning and an end, but it's not just storytelling.
Yeah, I don't think a beginning and an end makes a narrative structure, if I may say so.
Well,
But okay. But
We always begin in the middle, I thought.
But
We always
the
begin in
Bible
the
has
middle.
a- But the Bible has a narrative structure.
that certainly does.
The final question.
This actually ties in really well to what we were just discussing.
Now you've got to speak into the mic, please, and
This
introduce
ties in
yourself.
Really well. Oh, my name is Dina. I'm a graduate student in the English department, Professor Bhabha student. This ties in to what you were just discussing. I guess I've sort of been very aware this past week that you, as opposed to most of us in this room, have both have professional responsibilities, vocational responsibilities that are not merely academic, but also pastoral in a certain capacity. So I think that there's certain expectations upon all of us when we're talking about empathy to think in the theoretical realm. But I was wondering if, in preparing for these lectures and as the week has unfolded, if you have felt the tension between the knowledge you've come to about empathy through practice, through pastoral means, that is a realm separate and perhaps not appreciated in the conceptual realm that we're all sort of celebrating right now.
An invitation to a little bit of autobiography, you mean? Well, I think where it's come home to me in years of pastoral practice is something like this. I think I began as a pastor with a rather strong sense that what mattered was emotional identification, and realized how toxic that could be, because my own sense of satisfaction in that was bound up with attention to others, often in ways very hard to distinguish. And it takes one or two disastrous or damaging pastoral relationships to bring that home to one, and brought it home to me. So I think part of my agenda here is thinking about all of that, and thinking about what one of my colleagues once wonderfully called the dangers of pastoral lust, by which he didn't mean lust exercised by pastors, but the lust for pastoral identification.
I'm glad you clarified that.
And I know what he meant. We are, those of us who are pastors, I think, are all of us in some ways hungry for intimacy. And if I were to speak very theologically, I'd say the grace of God is that God uses that hunger for intimacy for creative, not just destructive purposes. But in the process of getting that clear in focus, you need to understand the ambivalence behind it all, and therefore I think to hold very, very clearly all the time that sense that you are the recipient, you are the seen, not just the seer, you are the patient as well as the agent, you are, and of course, the sinner as well as the saint. And that the pastoral encounter is not between the super-sensitive, emotionally vulnerable carer and the mere sufferer. You know, how much more interesting, how much better to be a super-sensitive carer than just a sufferer. Get beyond that and try to learn the right kind of clarity, the right kind of presence, which is not invested in all that. Buddhism is quite helpful at times here. Helps you be a Christian, among other things.
I want to bring this really very deep and wonderful and thoughtful panel to a close by reminding us of something that Rowan Williams said, and I will certainly take away and think about, as true for theology as it is for philosophy and pedagogy generally, which is that everything that is sayable must be hearable. I think this is so important, not only in terms of the freedom of thought, the freedom of speech, but because it really relates to something that is both ontological and ethical and scalable, which is voice, both in the institutional sense, social sense, as well as in the intersubjective realm. So before thanking the panel, which I want to do, usually when you do that, people burst out into clapping and you can't get any other message across. So let me get my second message across and then go to my primary pleasure and duty. Hospitality, neighborliness, storytelling, touch, taste, and the generosity and hospitality of institutions are all available to you in the rotunda, where there will be quotidian food and wine. But before we go there, let me thank Nicholas, Emma, Rowan, of course, for presiding over all this and for provoking it all. And both of you, thank you very much. Richard, thank you. Amy, thank the audience. You're always there for us. You're wonderful to the Mahindra Center. Thank you for being with us today and always. Thank you, sir.